The 2019 Global Business Services Investment Conference and Awards event took place in Durban, South Africa from the 19th to the 21st of November. This conference, hosted by BPESA, the South African Department of Trade and Industry, and the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Government, was intended to showcase South Africa's value proposition as a delivery destination for global business services. The program focused on the depth and breadth of service capability, the quality of skills of the youth, and the competitive opportunity for South Africa and continental Africa in the digitally enabled market for global services. South Africa has a compelling value proposition that has been well received by end users and BPOs in the main English-speaking source markets, including the UK, USA, Canada, and Australia. Building on this success, the value proposition has recently been refined to present the emerging digital capabilities and strong IT-enabled service capabilities in the country. This discussion shares work on South Africa's transition into the digital economy and to highlight where and how South Africa distinguishes itself as a location for digital and BPO service delivery.
So it's a panel discussion, but I more prefer to think of these things more like a salon. An exchange of ideas amongst individuals that really know their stuff, individuals that are at the heart of what's going on in the industry, not just domestically, but globally. And with that in mind, I'm going to briefly ask my co-panelists to quickly introduce themselves, and we'll get right into the discussion. So, to my immediate left, Stephan.
Yeah, my name is Stephan Malherbe. I'm the CEO and founder of Genesis Analytics. That's the largest economics consultancy in sub-Saharan Africa. And as you will hear shortly, we've been working really closely with this industry here in South Africa in ways that are really fascinating.
Good afternoon. My name is Malebo Mabitje-Thompson. I'm the Deputy Director General responsible for industrial financing in South Africa. That also involves the financial support that we offer to the global business services sector.
Thank you. This is Karthik. Pleasure to be back in South Africa again. My 17th time here, but first time in Durban. I am a partner with Everest Group. I have a global leadership role for our global sourcing practice that helps companies optimize global delivery models. I live in India, which at this stage is doing marginally better than South Africa in cricket. But pleasure to be back here again. Yeah.
Karthik, thank you for that sporting element to it. And I just want to make a point that right before we were coming on stage, Karthik and I were talking a little bit about sports and what we did, and he's an avid enthusiast about yoga and badminton, two absolutely wonderful pastimes. He asked me what my sport that I did was, and I said, I've recently taken up boxing, and he said, well, I'm going to sit furthest away possible from you. Karthik hasn't seen my record yet. There's a lot of KOs, and I'm usually on the receiving end of it. That's another thing. But there will be no punching, no scratching, and no body slams over the course of this discussion. Now, I'm delighted to have all three of you with me on stage today. I feel truly privileged to be able to be chatting with you about what's going on with the digital economy and what's happening in the digital age in regards to South Africa and potentially some trends around the world. And I'd ask you all to join with me for just a moment when we consider this country's path in terms of the digital age. If you join with me in a little bit of a time travel span, I can think back to the first trip I made to South Africa, my first of 12, and certainly won't be the last, when I came down to speak at a conference, and we were talking about trends in the South African contact center space. And what was readily apparent was, in 2004, this was very much a dynamic predicated on voice. Everything we were talking about was either live agent, it was IVR, or it was speech automated IVR. Now think about where we are today in the context of the digitization of our own lives, the digitization of business, the digitization of consumers with regards to enterprises from which they buy products and services. And Stephan, I'm going to throw it open to you to kick things off. Maybe you would be in a better position than anybody right now in this room, or potentially even in the country, to talk a little bit about the evolution of this country as it refers to the digitization of society, really, and where you see that going.
So let me just say something about the world before I say something about South Africa. Clearly, you know, we are living in an age which is unlike any of the last 120 years or so, but quite similar to the really big turning points. And one of those would be the Industrial Revolution. Some people say even the invention of agriculture. You know, how big is that? And so what we are seeing globally, of course, is a rewiring of economies due to digital. And this industry is at the heart of that rewiring, because it's changing how business is done, how services are delivered in many ways, and this is a revolution that's just begun. In South Africa, we are a strange amalgam of things digital. On the one hand, we've got 99% 3G coverage in the country, which is by far the highest on the continent. And we also have a youth population that is increasingly digitized. But the really critical thing for us is that from where we're sitting now as a company, but also as a government and as a society, the penny has dropped with us that the big opportunity is to use digital to sell South Africa's services to global entities and to global customers and consumers. So that's really what a lot of our work in the last year has been about.
Very good. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you we're also in for a bit of a treat today. Karthik from Everest Group has got a series of slides that he would like to present to us that effectively are going to give highlights of the most recent round of the South African GBS value proposition. Now, Karthik is an individual whose work I've known about for many, many years. We've only had the pleasure of meeting each other this first trip, but I can tell you that in terms of the intellectual magnitude of what he's going to be discussing with you today, we're very much, I think, in for some cutting-edge insight. And Karthik, I'd invite you to take the podium if you would.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. Pleasure to be part of the panel. Let me just give you some context on some recent work we've been doing with BPESA, DTI, and the South African GPS industry. So what we've been working on is to take a fresh view of the South African GBS value proposition, considering ICT, right? So how does that change, or what's the impact of that, considering the opportunities going forward and the digital related disruption or opportunities which Stephan and Peter talked about. Okay. And really what I wanted to convey through this is really one simple message for the prospective investors who are here, is to give you a sense of why South Africa, right? And as an independent analyst tracking both South Africa and different other global locations, how does South Africa fit in the global scheme of things, and why should you consider South Africa? Just to give you some sense on this, I'd like to draw your attention to the, okay, see the clicker, okay. The graph on the right, on the left. The growth, the South African industry has been growing at about 25% over the last few years, and having been involved with the sector for many years, really nice to see the growth. What is interesting is, this growth is about 3 times the global market average. And at a time when the global sourcing industry is going through disruption and is seeing, lesser headcount growth, South Africa's growth rate has been, pretty robust at 25%. Now, put this in context that it's a smaller base. Having said that, it's a pretty incredible growth. Now, what's driving this growth? Clearly, as many global companies have either outsourced or set up their own operations in South Africa, the experience has had a compounding effect on growth. Growing talent availability, and then, further with the boost towards impact sourcing, that has added a new dimension to the talent pool availability. A lot of government support from the DTI and other departments in the form of incentives and various other enabling environments to bolster the growth in the economy. Just a quick snapshot, industry served primarily telecom, technology and telecom, but then there's multiple industries being served, including financial services, education, retail. As may not be a surprise for you, UK is the largest client geography served, followed by Australia. But what's interesting, especially in the last couple of years, is an increase in the share of both North America and Africa. And just to be clear, this My presentation is going to largely touch upon it from a GBS export standpoint, so doing work from South Africa to serve other countries, and these numbers pertain to exports. The domestic market headcount is obviously much bigger. The last point is building on what Peter said. While contact center continues to be the mainstay, there has been a diversification evolving into many other areas, which we will talk about in a while. Okay. I don't need to go through all the detail on the slide. The fact of the matter is if you're prospective investors, you can see a number of enterprises that have either done work out of South Africa through their own shared services or global in-house centers, as we call that. A number of global service providers. But what's worth calling out here is a number of South African service providers, because you would expect global service providers to have footprint in multiple locations. But a number of South African service providers that have grown not just in terms of scale, but also in the breadth and depth of complexity of work. And this is just a snapshot of players. Okay. So I just want to spend a few minutes on this slide, right? We see 6 S's for success in South Africa, right? And why South Africa? The first is really, the skilled and young English-speaking workforce. And I'll show you some data earlier, but this has been talked about in the previous sessions. Fluent English speaking, very high levels of empathy with customers, and cultural affinity, as you know, is very important when it comes to especially customer experience kind of work. Large, young, and trainable talent pool, and then this is bolstered further by impact sourcing. Also, options across multiple cities. So it's not like many other locations. Countries, you pretty much have one city that's the base, but South Africa offers multiple options. The second point, and you've got to read it like an S, so I'm going to go with the second point here, which is around, while contact center is the strong foundation and will continue to be, there are many other niche areas for which companies are considering and can consider South Africa. Domain knowledge in financial services, right? The advanced financial system here that's on par with say the UK. We've seen emerging growth in multiple other areas, for example, legal process services, game development, learning management. So this is developing learning management tools that can support education technology, for example. So while contact center still continues to be the base, several areas to which the industry has diversified. Strengthening ICT and digital capabilities, and I'm going to spend some time on this later in the presentation. So very clearly, the focus, this ICT and digital, it would be wrong to think of this as a separate sector, right? Because that's really core to delivering the next level of value addition in any service you're delivering, right? Be it contact center, be it financial services, be it legal, ICT and digital, at least as we see this, is kind of underpinning everything. So, we're seeing evolving capabilities, for example, in omni-channel customer analytics. That's kind of the next wave of, high value-added services in contact center. Evidence of solutions in, cybersecurity, machine learning, big data analytics. I'll talk about a few examples later. Just to set the context, this is still evolving. It may not be as robust as the foundation for contact center yet. But then the good news to see that, there is a talent pool that's available and that can be trained to deliver these high value-added ICT and digital capabilities. Sophisticated infrastructure and enabling environment, that's always been a strength for South Africa. I'm sure investors who are coming in are experiencing it in terms of robust infrastructure, high quality of life. On these standards, of course, South Africa has taken a lead in some of the global contact center standards, but there's also a significant push towards data protection. So the POPI, which is really the protection of personal information, and GDPR compliance. So there are several areas where South African companies have established good standards that are very comparable to global standards. Cost savings. Now, obviously, cost is not the only reason why companies look to move work to any location, but then it is still important. If you were to look at it, 60-70% lower cost than compared to tier 2 locations in UK and Australia. 25-35% lower than the leading CE locations. At the same time, this is not the least cost location. Right? Locations like India and Philippines are somewhat lower cost. But then once we consider the impact of the incentives in South Africa, which I'll talk about in a while, the differential tends to narrow. And the last point I want to talk about is the regional and domestic market opportunity. While this is applicable in all services, especially in ICT and digital, that plays a value, kind of a critical way to kind of accelerate these capabilities. So large domestic market with growing in digital solutions, be it in the banking space, big data and analytics, and global companies could use South Africa as a base to develop a lot of the ICT digital solutions to serve South Africa and also the rest of Africa. So so that's in some ways the summary of the value proposition as we see this. Just wanted to share with you a few more slides just to bring this to life. I talked about the large talent pool with niche skill availability. If you were to look at it from a pure supply of new talent for English language BPO, South Africa is the third largest. And if you look at it, it's not too far behind the Philippines when you look at just the entry-level talent. Now, if you look at the size of the industries, the Philippines industry is about 20 times larger than what South Africa is today. But this really points to the fact that there is a lot of potential when we look at the entry-level talent that could be employed. So it's not only in terms of pure English language talent, a sizable pool that's studying law. One of the leaders, South Africa, in terms of looking at CFA charter holders and actuarial degree holders. So this is an interesting statistic. When it comes to actuaries, the number of people in South Africa are actually 8 times more than what you have in India. So it clearly shows that there are several pockets of skill pool. When it comes to ICT, right, and this is really graduates who may be trained in things like information technology, engineering. The story is very similar. Obviously, India is at a much larger scale, but the pool in South Africa is fairly sizable from a both scale, youth, and trainable perspective. And there are multiple training efforts. Of course, we've heard about what Harambee and different companies are doing, but even in things like We Think Core, Data Science Academy. So there are different avenues available to train companies, to train the young graduates, even when it comes to ICT. And all this, once you add to it the layer of additional talent pool that you can tap through impact sourcing, it makes for a significantly large potential. I've talked about this. I don't want to spend too much time, but just want to call out a few niche areas. Banking insurance, several areas in complex financial services. This could mean things like your debt management, for example, increasing insurance type services, fund accounting, asset management. So this goes back to my point around the South African financial services system being fairly evolved. Legal, again, South Africa starting to be seen as a robust legal process destination, especially when it comes to complex work and LPO. ICT and digital, and you've got some examples of work that are being done here in South Africa to serve the regional market or the exports market. RPA in finance and accounting. What I found very interesting was this case example of a company that has actually developed an integrated learning management tool in collaboration with tech giants, and that's something fairly interesting. Game development, advent of digital banks. So several pockets of strength when it comes to ICT and digital, and a lot more potential to scale. Okay. Just some more context on ICT and digital. Clearly, if you look at the overall ICT sector, the growth rate for next-gen technologies, by next-gen we mean cybersecurity, cloud, mobility, analytics, in South Africa is twice that of the overall sector. Because the overall sector also includes things like your traditional application development, maintenance, but the next-gen technology is seeing significant growth. Concerted efforts to build these complex IT skills through government, academia collaboration. And what I also have here is some examples of high-end digital work being done. I don't need to walk through all these details, but as we see this, these are very similar to solutions that we see happening in places like your India, Poland, just that the scale is a bit different. But then in terms of underlying capabilities and evidence of these high-end skills, South Africa has already seen multiple examples of these, be it in area of machine learning, blockchain, or predicting customer behavior using advanced analytics. Okay, I'm going to skip this. I just want to call out that when it comes to ICT digital, South Africa actually houses 2 Azure data centers by Microsoft and 1 by Huawei. And then the other thing I want to call out is around the customer-oriented legislation related to protection of personal information. So these are a few things that strengthen South Africa's enabling infrastructure as far as ICT and digital is concerned. Gateway to Africa story is a lot talked about. A few things that I want to emphasize here is while this Gateway to Africa story can be applied to any sector, right? You could apply it into any form of BPS, but especially in ICT, considering that South Africa is a fairly advanced and developed market. The fact that there is a significant domestic demand which companies can leverage to develop capabilities and then serve rest of Africa, or potentially even the export markets. So that's the path forward that I personally see for South Africa to grow when it comes to ICT and digital. It's a little different when it came to contact center, because contact center, the key strength was sort of UK, Australia to begin with, and then expanded to North America and Africa. But in ICT, I see the future evolving a bit differently. So you would start domestic, regional, and then consider exports as far as ICT is concerned. Right. Okay. Just one more slide, and then I'll give it back to the panel discussion. As I said, cost is not the only reason why companies make location decisions, but it's still an important consideration. So this is really giving you a view on operating costs. This is for contact center. But the point I want to make here is that compared to a number of the Central European locations and source locations from which you are considering leveraging South Africa offers significant arbitrage, right? The cost differential with the UK Tier 2 is almost 60–70%. The actual savings will be somewhat lesser because once you consider transition costs and investments, but the arbitrage is significant. As I said, locations like India and Philippines will still be lower cost. But then this is where I just want to talk about the GBS sector incentives that are offered by the DTI. That helps reduce costs in South Africa by another 7–10%. Right? And then that sort of, as I said earlier, narrows the gap between India, Philippines, and South Africa. I don't want to drain this clearly from an infrastructure, robust, enabling environment perspective. If you were to look at pure delivery locations, meaning the likes of Egypt, Philippines, India, Poland, Mauritius, several areas where South Africa's evolved. You talked about mobile cellular, telephone subscriptions, IP protection, financial systems. So these are several enabling factors that position South Africa well going forward. Last but not the least, multiple things as we call as the enabling environment. So I talked about the national level incentives programs, various skills development programs, right? And as we see, different countries that are evolving, the number of, skills development programs that are available in South Africa, it's pretty interesting and commendable to see. Yes, there is more work to be done to translate that into, meaningful, impact and growth. And that is both a challenge and an opportunity. As we see this in many global locations, it is the same challenge everywhere. So it's not a challenge, unique to South Africa. But the good thing to see is several foundational elements are in place. Infrastructure developments, South Africa offers a first world infrastructure when it comes to roads, real estate, etc. And then, several provisions in place for small enterprises and startups. So let me conclude here. Net, a very interesting story and a promising story in terms of growth. And lots of opportunity ahead for South Africa. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Karthik, that was a great discussion. We truly appreciate the context that you've given us. And before we came on, Andy took me aside and he asked me if I could just share with you a little bit of insight in terms of some of the research that I've done to complement the fantastic quality of the slides that Karthik has just shared. Every year, my company, Ryan Strategic Advisory, does a survey of 500 enterprise contact center decision makers, so effectively buyers of contact center services. Now, one of the questions that we ask, and it's probably one of the most eagerly anticipated questions that we do every year, is the favorability that these buyers in North America, Western Europe, and Australia have towards different offshore locations with regards to delivery for consumers in their domestic markets. Now, what's interesting about South Africa from the buyer perspective was when we first undertook this survey, out of roughly 40 or so countries that we posed, South Africa was fourth. The second year that we did the survey, it was tied for third. This year, it was tied for second place. What this demonstrates, and in just a little snapshot, what this demonstrates is the fact that there's a great deal of favorability that South Africa has in the key demand markets around the world, and the fact, too, that this favorability, that this level of willingness to look at South Africa, to consider South Africa, appears to be growing, which I think is fantastic news from a buyer perspective, and great news for providers in this room, whether you're homegrown providers, whether you are providers of an international scale, or if you're kicking tires on the market right now and thinking about working in South Africa. So we're going to kick off our panel discussion now, and at a certain point I will open up the opportunity for questions from the audience. For those of you from the UK, I feel a little bit like David Dimbleby preparing to do a BBC question time, but we'll have just as much fun, I think, over the course of the next 20 minutes or so. So I'd like to kick the discussion off by asking our representative from the DTI Malebo, and we're delighted to have you here today. Thank you very much for joining us. If you could tell us a little bit about the DTI's vision for the digital economy in South Africa and how this is being prioritized by policymakers.
So one of the driving missions of the DTI is to build an economy that is based on realization of the full potential of South Africans. And right there you would see where the important transformation that's taking place in the ICT sector, in actual fact across all sectors, cannot be ignored if you're talking about developing an economy. So the global business services sector, as far back as the late 2000s, was identified as an important sector of growth for South Africa. So when we did our first industrial policy action plan, it was there as one of our key sectors. Now it has taken an interesting level of importance, given what is happening globally and the realization of the entire world, really, that the fourth industrial revolution is upon us. We see this sector as an important entry sector for South Africa. So when we hear assessments that tells us that we do have capability in the ICT sector, those are very important for us. We see those capabilities transcending into many other sectors. We support the film sector, and you'll ask me, why am I talking about film here? But when you look at animation, and you see what capabilities we have in ICT and the rest of the digital sector, you can see where the marriage happens. So we see ICTs as very important. Manufacturing is important for us, but it has taken on a different role. You could literally be sitting in India and some 3D printer in South Africa is producing goods for you, and a person sitting in Durban is selling those goods for you. And we want to be part of that value chain. And we believe that this sector will put us in the most profitable parts of the global production value chain.
Well, I think that's a really, really good response, and thank you for that. You know, one of the things that struck me about what you just brought out was the fact that it's multifaceted. There's different approaches to different sectors. You brought the film sector out, and I can speak from the context of living in Canada, in the city that I'm based in Montreal. They made a priority out of film, out of the technology that goes into cinema and to entertainment, and it's created literally thousands of jobs in the community, high-tech jobs, ones that are focused around value, ones that are focused around the technological backgrounds, and have truly improved the community in so many ways. You know, Stephan, I throw it over to you right now. I'm very curious from the standpoint of what Genesis has been researching and what you've been observing as a thought leader in this space. For any economy, whether it was South Africa or otherwise, what do you think are the fundamental precepts that they must have in place if they're going to develop a global business service sector that's truly going to respond to the needs of today and going into tomorrow?
So Karthik really, told us what those are. But I think the critical elements in the South African value proposition is firstly the deal. The deal is fantastic empathy, fantastic enthusiasm, fantastic human material at a very competitive price. And this did not just happen. That's the other thing I think that particularly prospective investors should know. This did not just happen automatically. It's the result of a long-standing partnership between government, and the industry as represented by BPESA. And I think it's the most successful partnership of that kind that I've seen in the country, and probably one of the most successful that I've seen in any of the 30, 40 countries in which we work every year. It is really, I think, achieved a lot already with that 25% a year growth in employment. But we believe that the best is yet to come. So what our research showed is that it is entirely feasible to add another 100,000 seats. And I'm speaking here about export, not 250,000 that's servicing the local industry, by 2023. And we also believe that we can achieve, including that extra 100,000 between now and 2030, so in 10 years, we can achieve 500,000 growth in employment. And the reason why we can do that is because we feel we've got a combination of capabilities now that ticks all of Karthik's boxes, and that I think will grow from strength to strength going forward. It means that we've got to penetrate some of our markets more deeply, there's no doubt. You know, we are a very UK-centric market, 78% is UK-based. We've made some inroads in Australia, but we think there's a North American market, including Montreal, that's waiting for us. It means we've got to make bounds and leaps in shared services. And luckily, you know, we are in an economy which doesn't have a BPO sector sitting on, you know, a very basic economy. All the really core domains of insurance, banking, IT, retail, other services are really strong in South Africa. So that sophisticated base has given us something to work with, and I think something to offer.
And it's interesting that we talk a little bit about the legacy of excellence in different industries. One of the things that struck me as I have studied this country over the years is that coming to the table with strong skills in, say, finance or technology or engineering, this is something that South Africa literally has decades in. And I think having that mindset, having that ability to almost permeate the culture is so important in terms of giving referenceability and drawing positive vibes from potential investors. And that's maybe a good segue, Karthik, to have a quick word with you about, you know, obviously Everest Group is very international. I see your analysts at different events that I go to all the time, have a great respect for the work that Everest Group is doing. You know, one of the things I'd be curious to get from you is what you've been able to observe in different markets around the world that have been really successful in terms of embracing the digital economy and elements of the digital economy as it relates to their BPO or GBS services. What are some of the comparative success stories that you've seen, perhaps, of some of the larger locations and perhaps even some of the more niche locations?
That's a great question, Peter. I think, so I'll keep it focused from a GBS standpoint because digital economy is actually much broader. The first is, I think, the countries that we believe are successful. And I'm not going to talk about locations like India because it's a much different scale. We would consider locations like Poland, for example, to be fairly evolved. Right? There are three things that has made them successful. One, they're celebrating innovation in the GBS sector. So I think what I would like to see more in conferences like these is people coming and talking about what innovation have they brought in service delivery. Beyond delivering, you know, what's been done, innovation could be in the form of analytics or just thinking about value in a different way. So one, this culture of innovation. The second is really around talent pool. And let's face it, there is no country in this world today where there is no skill shortage when it comes to digital. Even India, which you would consider as the largest market, day in and day out, companies face the same challenge. And rather than taking an approach that says, look, we need everything to be solved at an institutional level before you can go and scale, companies need to be thinking about practical approaches. Right? You know, can we, for example, a leading global company in the Philippines has started a course which they've embedded, you know, within a university. It's just their course. It's about 100 people to train in artificial intelligence. Now, does it solve all their problems? It doesn't. But then when 10 companies do something like this, it starts to create that wave. So I think taking a very practical approach to, that's my second thing. And the third is really around when companies in these locations talk about why in that location, or it's really not about the cost. In fact, they change their story to value. And sometimes that value may actually mean I'm reducing headcount but delivering more value. Right? And that's kind of the next level of evolution. So I think that's just the change in mindset, right? At least what we would call in the industry as moving from a provider to a partner. It's the same kind of ethos mindset that I see working well.
And it's interesting because there's a word that you just used that we've heard frequently throughout this discussion, and that's partner and partnership. The reality is that partnership between all the industry stakeholders and singing from the same hymn book is crucial in terms of being able to move an industry forward. And I love the example you made of Poland, because I've had a chance to do some work in Central and Eastern Europe, and funnily enough, one of the most interesting locations I found from an IT services or an ICT perspective has been Belarus, a country I've had the chance to visit a few times. And the work that's going on, because of the partnership between the universities, between the private sector, between the Department of Education, the Department of Trade, has been phenomenal. We've seen significant growth in terms of exports of IT services from that country over the course of the past few years, and it's continuing to this day. And Malebo, that would be a great chance to bring you in for maybe your insights in regards to the evolution of the partnership between the DTI, the industry, and the industry association, and how you feel that that's been able to enable the sector, and where you see that going in the coming years.
Maybe let me start by saying partnerships are difficult. That's why sometimes they don't emerge naturally. But what we've been able to do in this sector is forge a partnership around a vision that we all buy into. And the first part of it is that we all see this sector as important, its growth as critical to the development of this country, and that every part of the puzzle has value to add. And because we've transcended beyond just each for themselves, and now we're looking at what we can do together, it has made partnering easy. And I would echo your sentiments that what we've been able to achieve in this sector is something that needs to be emulated, even in other sectors, where between ourselves as government, industry, the different stakeholders in industry, we've been able to craft a mission, work towards a value proposition, and the realization of that value proposition. We started really from zero, where it was just mainly industry doing what industry thought was best, and we as government using our incentives in a way not to incentivize, but really to force industry to do what we thought was best. And I think we've now evolved to a place where the incentive instrument is actually used to incentivize growth as opposed to force any particular behavior. And that is the best place of a partnership where everybody finds their sweet spots. So that's where I would say we are. And our expectation is that we will continue to grow. We're going into various other areas where we were not partnering in before, areas such as skills and the various inputs that are required to build this sector. We're saying it's 750,000 jobs that we can potentially get out of this sector. And we are going to put our money where our mouth is as far as that's concerned. And our industry partners are well up to the challenge, we believe.
Well, that's great. And, I'm going to throw it open to questions in a second or two. But before I do, Stephan, I wanted if you could maybe jump back into the discussion. As you know, we're very fortunate because we've got a number of prospective investors literally from around the world that are eyeing up South Africa as a fantastic location that they might want to consider perhaps making partnerships, making acquisitions, building greenfield. what counsel would you give our friends who are here from North America, from South America, from Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, in terms of what they should be looking out for in regards to opportunities in this market and potential challenges that they might want to think about as well as they look at South Africa from a competitive standpoint?
So I've just got one single piece of advice for them, Peter, and that is they shouldn't be speaking to me. And to some extent, they shouldn't even be speaking to Malebo, although it's a good start in many respects. They should be speaking to their colleagues who are already running centers here in South Africa and have done so for 5-10 years. Because when Malebo and I speak to them, what we hear is, a very, very positive set of real-life experiences of running a business here, of expanding, of obtaining skills, of pulling off the whole trick. So my advice to you would be, don't listen to us, listen to them. That would be my one piece of advice. In terms of South Africa, South Africa is a country that has great resilience. It's a country with enormous depth of institutions and of capabilities. And it's a country where, on the surface, things may sometimes seem stormy. But in a way that's also true of India, Karthik. Foundationally and fundamentally, there's a momentum which is moving forward.
Excellent. So we've got about 5 minutes left. And Andy, are we still cool with the... okay, so Andy, for those of you from North America, you'll understand what I'm about to say. He's going to play Phil Donahue for the next few minutes. And we'll take a few questions. Does anybody have any questions from the audience? If you do, could you put your hand up? Oh, birthday boy himself. Victor? There we go. Perfect. You're on the air.
All right. As an investor, considering South Africa as a potential site, either through a partnership or coming in and doing something from scratch, how much control does the government have over the industry? I asked that because, like in the Philippines, there are some restrictions now that President Duterte won't sign something, and that kind of affects the whole industry. So, how much control will you guys have over the industry?
Thank you. We are a different type of a country when it comes to powers, including of presidents over industry. We've got a constitution that regulates that very well. So generally, the tendency of government is not to interfere too much in industry, but to strive for partnerships that allows a win-win situation. As I said, where we are now, we're looking at policies that will enable this sector to grow as opposed to limiting the growth of the sector. We're looking at policies that will review the risk profile, should there be, of South Africa in relation to all our global competitors, all with a view to grow the sector. So as far as industry control is, this is not one of those industries where government has any particular level of control. Of course, there are regulations in terms of labor, in terms of a variety of standards, but those are transparent. So way before you make your own investment, you already are aware of what the environment has to offer. The president has given everybody a directive to roll out red carpet. Unfortunately, I can't promise you that today, but once you sign on that dotted line, I will bring the red carpet by mandate of the president.
Can I add something?
Fire away, please.
To that here? So in Genesis, we do more work for corporates, for industry, than we do for government. And we must work over a 24-month period in about 20 sectors here in South Africa, and we do more work outside South Africa than we do here. So this is our experience. Our experience is that South Africa is a well-regulated country. It's a country with the Anglo-Saxon notion of rule of law, by which I mean there are rules, there's no doubt. It's not an anarchy, but those are the rules. There's very little discretion in our system for politicians at any level, mayoral, provincial, premiers, or national, to interfere on some discretionary basis of the kind that I think you described. This is also not a country where one needs a license to start a business. And I think that tells you about something about the principle, and the principle is as long as you stick by the rules, you will be left alone. And I think that one other thing I want to say about this government and industries is that it sticks to its promises.
Absolutely.
When it makes a deal or gives a set of incentives, it sticks to those. I've seen this in a number of, in many instances, also instances where it turned out to be quite costly. I'm thinking about energy sectors for now. So those are all things that I think should give one comfort.
Right. Karthik, do you have any thoughts?
So I think just on this, right, I think just want to call out this fairly unique form of incentive which the government has for the GBS sector here. Right? It's kind of really linked to job creation. So it's really linked to the number of jobs you create. So that's the reason I say it's unique is it's quite linked to the objective of job creation. And then there are different levels of incentives based on the kind of work you're bringing in. Right? So I think that also links to the whole objective of yes, we need to build on the base that you have, but also evolve into high value-added services. So I think those are things which we see as positive from a South Africa standpoint.
So we've got literally 16 seconds left on the panel, but Andy, I'll just bequeath, do we have any other questions from the audience? Oh, I see some back here. So Stephen Ferber from Golden Gate BPO.
Yeah, I had a question on Karthik's slides. When you, the slide where you're showing the growth of job growth year by year, the part that showed the head count by city was just surprising to me. In terms of Johannesburg being a lower head count, the lowest head count between comparison to Durban and Cape Town, and I'm just curious if you guys could talk a little bit with those three cities, why the head count is where it's at.
Sure, Karthik, please go for it.
Okay, so just to be clear now, that was really about the, again, we can have a separate conversation later. That really was about the split of the export sector, the GBS export sector. So, Cape Town has been the largest, and for multiple reasons, given historically how the industry has evolved, and then obviously it's an attractive place for companies to live in. So that's really been the growth. Cape Town has been the largest for a while, but then we're seeing significant growth happening in locations like Durban. So I think the point we want to make here is there are multiple location options available for investors, and depending on the kinds of skills that they're looking for, or the kind of value proposition that they're seeking. So for example, a location like Cape Town gives you an access to a larger pool of existing talent. Durban, again, gives you the opportunity to build something. So again, depending, and then there are other tier 2, 3 city options as well. So depending on your objectives, you could think of what location suits the specific objectives.
Thank you very much. And Ev's told me that we've got a chance for one more question. So yes, please.
Hi, Zosu Mokonene from Zidomanzi Group. I think in a way we kind of represent the technology young disruptor community here in South Africa. And our technology that we're developing is basically bringing automation to desktop computing. And one of the things that we find to be a bit of a challenge, and it's not the responsibility so much of government necessarily, or even businesses, really just being able to relook at how do both government and business look at facilitating the ability to invest into technology and disruptors. Because if we're competing with the Ubers and Googles of the world, and we talked this morning about trust and the trust economy, the difficulty in understanding that, when the guys started Google, they didn't even have a bank account to put their first $100,000 into. But the regulations and the applications that are the process that it takes for an African innovator to really get the facilitation to compete can take a year or more in the way that things are set up and facilitated. Whereas when you look at places like Y Combinator and 500 startups, their models are really that we'll invest into 500 startups and 2 of them will become Uber or Google or Facebook. And we will not look at the fact that they will have to run at a profit. Most of Silicon Valley innovators are running at a loss even now. In fact, Uber is still running at a loss as we speak today. So I think it's not really the fault so much, but it's really just about the historical issues that Africa has faced and the fact that jobs are such an issue. But if you were to tell a young Microsoft how many jobs are you going to create, that wouldn't be their focus. Their focus would be on the innovation that they're trying to develop and what they're trying to sort of disrupt. So I think it's that dichotomy, and it's sort of the question is are there any considerations around how to better facilitate being able to invest into accelerating the innovator community?
Anybody want to take a shot at that? Stephan, please.
I'll start. We have a couple of programs that now are seeking to do that. There's an incentive that National Treasury offers through the Income Act, which looks at supporting venture capitalists who then invests in innovation. And from the DTI, we've got a sector-specific program that focuses on innovation. But the issue that you are raising, there's an issue of a supply-side measure, which is what I'm talking about, the incentives to support the innovation. And there's the other side, which is the demand for that innovation. And in most instances, what we find is that it's the mismatch between the two, that sometimes some of these innovations don't find themselves market in South Africa. That makes it very difficult to continue supporting the innovation that will eventually be industrialized, say, in Germany and various markets, which we found with some of the innovations that government has supported previously. I think there's a lot of market education that needs to go into educating businesses about innovation. That then helps us to deal with both the demand side and the supply side to support innovators. We can do better. There are a lot of localities which offer a lot more support to innovators. And it is something that for us, I know in the department, we're reviewing what we should be supporting and ways in which that support should transcend from just financial support for the innovation to commercial support for that innovation to be market viable.
So it's a great question, and a lot of the work that we've done has been in how does one establish an ecosystem for digital innovation in the country, exactly what you're wrestling with. And you're right, South Africa has a very advanced and mature banking system. So for debt financing, for the kind of investors with the kind of track record who are in this room and considering to come in from abroad, whether it's mortgage-based finance or many different kinds of finance, all of that is there. For equity investment in that private equity segment, where companies are not just revenue positive, but also profit positive. We've got a very well-developed private equity system. But it's before then that there's a gap. And it's a gap that government is filling. Also, I think Department of Science and Innovation has had very, very successful, effectively grants for the development of commercializable technology. But if we look at India, if we look at at the US, we still got a way to go with early stage, there's no doubt.
Well, I think we are at the end of the session. Thank you very much to my distinguished panelists. Would you give them a round of applause?